but largely in terms of the implications for economies around the world and the different regional responses to this war in Europe. And for us, as we all know, of course, we're dealing with one crisis on top of another crisis. And today we're going to be essentially focusing on the implications of this war on the global international financial architecture. And as we speak, of course, the war in Ukraine is now in its third month. Unexpectedly, for a war that many had thought would have been over in a matter of days. When we take a look at sanctions, we're now in the sixth iteration of sanctions. And these impacts and implications, their consequences, are yet to be fully discovered because they continue to evolve as we speak. And the effects are multifaceted. And as we said already, they impact all countries, rich and small, poor. Every segment of society right now is impacted. In our examination of the war and its implications for the global financial infrastructure today, we will be taking a look at a number of issues, including the legal dimensions of the freezing of Russian-owned assets, not just by the state, but by private investors as well. The implications for the United States in terms of the greenback, the US dollar, as the world's reserve currency, alternatives to SWIFT, for example, and many other issues are going to be the subject of our conversation this afternoon, which is going to be, we hope, lively and informal. We intend to have a conversation between us for about 45 minutes, 50 minutes, after which we would very much like to engage with you in a very interactive sessions, after which, of course, we will partake on a few refreshments in the back of the room. And joining me here this afternoon to help us unpick some of the complexities of these issues that we are faced with is my friend and colleague, Bernard Simon. I will call him in the way that I know him as Bashir, so it's the same gentleman. And he is the head and our expert at the BDA for financial diplomacy, as well as for fintech. So, Bashir, welcome. It is a delight to share this stage with you.
Thank you.
And let's get started with our very first look at these series of issues. The first, welcome, madam. Please, if you would like to take a seat at the front, we'd be very happy. Okay. Let's get started. We get a sense that Russia is really very, very important as an actor on the global stage. In terms of geography, it's the largest country. In terms of population, certainly not the largest, with 176 million, and I could be wrong by a few million people. But it has a commanding share of many sectors and many commodities of importance to the world. We know recently we've been speaking about wheat, we've been speaking about food crises, which we will get into. But Russia is also the world's leading exporter of natural gas and the second largest producer and exporter of oil. Geopolitically, Russia is a country that also punches above its weight for many reasons, all valid. And these are some of the issues that we will get into later on as we continue our conversation. But Bashir, in terms of taking a look at the importance of Russia as an economic actor, help us understand the dimensions and the scope of this importance, the significance of Russia economically, globally.
Thank you, Len, and thank you, everybody, for being here. Very simply put, I think by now most of you would know that the size of the Russian economy equals the size of the Belgian and the Dutch economy. So in terms of absolute size, it's not really large. In terms of currency, of course, it is not significant because it's not a main reserve currency globally. What is significant about the Russian role in the global economy is not just the issue of it being a dominant energy supplier, but even in that area, in terms of oil, it has joined forces somewhat informally with OPEC. I call it ROPEC. So it's Russia plus OPEC, and it's referred to, I think, in the press as OPEC plus. And that helps to keep oil supplies down and oil prices up. But resources is not the only area in which Russia is significant. Russia is a producer of fertilizers together with Belarus and Ukraine. It has a very large and dominant share in global fertilizer, generally fertilizer, whether it's potash or other fertilizers. And that feeds into the price of food and therefore into food security. Its operations in the Ukraine, of course, have led to wheat exports from the Ukraine being impeded effectively. De facto, it's in the silos. But more critically, it is also going to affect next year's season harvest. And that, by the way, includes chicken feed. I know it has been not really widely reported, but chicken prices, poultry prices are likely to move towards beef prices, also because next year's harvest has been impeded. Nickel, which is a key ingredient in stainless steel, is a main export of the Ukraine, and Ukraine is dominant in exporting nickel. So much so that if you talk to stainless steel contractors, respectable contractors who've been in the business for a long time, they would tell you that they cannot quote a price beyond a few hours because the price of stainless steel is going up. Export of steel itself, of course, has been impacted because of the war. And so we should expect to see very direct impact on our domestic economies in various areas, as you mentioned, Len, in food, but also in contracting, because contractors, building contractors, are very reluctant now, for example, to give prices because they don't know what the price of raw materials is going to be tomorrow, or whether they will get it or not, and whether they will finish on time or not, because, of course, if they don't finish on time, then there will be fines imposed on them by virtue of the contracts with the developers. So the cascading domino effect of both the Russian economy but also the war is multifaceted, and we haven't even started to talk about the rest of the world. The Egypt, the Algerias, the Lebanons, the Peru, Brazil, and various other parts of the world that are dependent in many ways on various exports from either Russia, Ukraine, or Belarus. And so perhaps that's something also for us to explore, in fact, in this conversation.
Thank you, Bashir. Just listening to you...
Can I add one thing?
Of course.
Perhaps it's a good point to say that geoeconomics now is the key, or will become, was already the key driver of geopolitics. And I think that is going to be a theme that will dominate our discourse on international relations for some time to come. Until now, geoeconomics was somewhat ambiguous, was somewhat sort of the poor cousin of geopolitics, was somewhat real international relations considered to be perhaps confined mainly to energy and resources. But now geoeconomics is filtering into all aspects of not only the items that I mentioned, but perhaps we can at some point explore the direct impact on inflation.
Yeah, no.
Because of its relevance to domestic politics across the world.
There's absolutely just so much to really explore. But as you were speaking, I couldn't help but think that just a few months ago, as economies slowly started to open, which we thought 2022 was going to be the year of global recovery, but we know that global prospects have already been forecasted as being downgraded by as much as 3%. But just a few months ago, we were talking about the need for more lorry drivers. And more recently, we're talking about the need for more lorries because the parts required to continue production of those big machines that move goods across borders just simply don't exist anymore because of tremendous strain on global supply chains. Do you expect this to continue to become even worse in the short term?
Not just the short term. I think the reconfiguration of the global economy clearly is going to last for some time, with not only primary direct impacts, but also secondary and tertiary consequences. You mentioned supply chains and the lorry driver's dilemma and so forth. Before the war on Ukraine, we already had inflationary pressures building up globally. And these inflationary pressures were starting to manifest themselves in not only price increases, but also in currency volatility and so forth. That was the cause of that was not just COVID and pent-up demand because of COVID, but also the shortening of supply chains. Shortening of supply chains means for countries during COVID who felt that their supply chains were compromised because they were in China or elsewhere and they were not then served well by the supply chain, they bring it closer to home. To bring it closer to home means that the basic cost of production will go up, and that's inflationary. So reconstructing supply chains globally already was causing, apart from bottlenecks because of pent-up demand, the shortening of supply chains, some decoupling, if you hear of decoupling, which is to move away from a globalization of the supply chain, and so forth. Those inflation pressures, and of course energy prices, those inflation pressures were building up already. The war on Ukraine led to its own sequence of events leading to further inflationary pressure. And if it hadn't been, my opinion, if it hadn't been for COVID and the shortening of supply chain, we would have still had inflationary pressures building up because of the war on the Ukraine, because it affected not only resources, but also, as I mentioned, foodstuff and raw materials and all sorts of elements that go into the economy. The problem, the challenge actually, that we will all face in democratic and non-democratic societies, but particularly in democratic societies, is that inflation is always an I call it, and I tell my students always, that inflation is an indirect regressive tax. It is effectively a tax that is applied equally to everybody. Now, regressive tax, by their very nature, at the wrong time of the cycle, economic cycle, mean that you will have a widening gap between the haves and the have-nots in an exponential, not linear way. The gap opens up very rapidly and widens very quickly. I'm not talking about the perceptional elements of poverty. I'm confining myself to actual purchasing power. That means, in domestic political terms, that political polarization increases. And when political polarization increases in democratic systems, it means veering to the extremes, to both ends. In non-democratic systems, it means whatever it means when bread prices shoot up, when prices of basic food items and living, basic living elements become either really unaffordable or sometimes unaffordable by perception. And so that may lead to unrest in various parts also of the world. So the inflationary pressures now that we are having will not be politically neutral in my view. And this is why I think it is absolutely incumbent on the international system to stabilize various parts of the world. The stabilization effort, I think, this is why I said geoeconomics will lead geopolitics and international relations. The stabilization efforts are going to become an integral part of the geoeconomic equation in international relations. And that, I think, will last for some time to come. I think the Bank of France, for example, anticipates that inflation will be with us at least until 2023. So we're not talking about tomorrow. We're talking about at least a year. And a year is a very long time in international relations when we have this degree of complexity and volatility.
Okay. A couple of things come to mind, Bashir, and I don't want us to get too far ahead of ourselves because geopolitics are going to be the end game for us in terms of our own conversation. But two quick things, because I do want to get us back to the issue of sanctions, okay? But even before that, you raised an interesting comment in terms of global supply chains, you know, in taking a look at what happened with COVID, followed now by the war, which has, in a sense, accelerated trends that we were already seeing. But one could also argue that even before that, we were seeing disruptions to global supply chains during the Trump administration. That tit-for-tat war with China on the issue of steel and alumina, which actually caught not just China, because China at that time was supplying less than 1% of steel to the United States. But caught up in that net were all of America's allies: Japan, South Korea, Mexico, Europe, among the top 4 and 5. So in a sense, we're seeing, you know, a deepening in scope and reach of instability and decoupling of global supply chains that started, and perhaps one might argue, even before Trump administration. I don't want us to get stuck on that. It was just an observation I wanted to make, because I want to come back to the point of sanctions.
But I think it's an important point, Len, because it's true, of course, but despite that, there was confidence and trust in the international rules-based system.
Absolutely.
So there was still the context in which people thought, we will arbitrate this. We will negotiate that. We will arrive at some deals. And so there was still, I mean, this is the problem with the war. There are many problems, of course, with the war on Ukraine, but it fundamentally undermined the rules-based system.
And we're going to
And
come
so
to
trust
that.
and confidence
Yep.
has suddenly evaporated, and
Yep.
this is really
Yep.
so.
And I think this is an important point that we're going to need to come back to. The legal basis of some of the issues that we need to speak about. But I just want to get over this issue of sanctions, because at this point in time, when you take a look and add up all of the sanctions that face Russia, there are more than 6,900 of them at the latest count. I mean, Russia is the most sanctioned country in the world. And the consequential effects of all of those sanctions on the rest of the world have not yet been counted and are really still basically in a phase of evolution. And these sanctions have been broad and deep, right? From freezing of assets of both the state and private persons and investors, freezing access to currency reserves by Russian central bank, actions taken that have impeded greatly the ability of the Russian central bank to operate in a normal way, denial of access to SWIFT, for example, banning of exports of key technology to Russia, banning of secondary trade in Russian government bonds. And when we take a look at the global picture, clearly all of these are going to have huge impacts for the global financial architecture. What are we looking at?
Yes. Back in December, I told my students, this was when the Russians were massing their forces on the borders. I sent an email to my students. I said, what was the response to massing all these armored brigades and 250,000 soldiers? What was the response of the West? To take you off SWIFT. I called it tanks versus banks. It's the first time in history where actually financial sanctions have been used as a tool to deter a war. Now, when a great power finally decides to go to war, I don't think financial sanctions in and by themselves would stop them, and that's exactly what happened. The importance, however, of the financial sanctions, and let's not forget, financial sanctions were introduced within a week. As you said, deep and broad financial sanctions were introduced within a week. These sanctions have been in design and being prepared since the occupation of Crimea. And so they've been refined and so forth over time. The inability of a state, a market, to trade in particular in technology and to raise finance for its own purposes, i.e. public debt, bonds, as you said, is crippling. I would contend, however, that however crippling the financial sanctions may be, I think the technology sanctions long-term are going to be the most effective tool that will have the most disabling impact on the development of the Russian economy. In fact, a recent report, I was very surprised, a recent report by the Russian Central Bank itself, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks ago I saw it, anticipates the reverse industrialization of Russia and the return of shuttle trade. I don't know whether the term means anything to you. Shuttle trade in the 90s, when Russia was undergoing the transformation to a capitalist economy, I saw them myself. You saw Russians chartering flights, going to Istanbul and buying physically everything they could buy, getting back in the evening on the same flight and returning to Russia. I think longer term, particularly, for example, the sanctions on the software used to develop semiconductors is going to be absolutely devastating for the Russian economy. I'm interested in this from a financial, diplomatic, and services perspective because trade, technology, and finance are converging. And so the inability to use certain technologies will also impede the ability to transact efficiently financially, which will also impede the ability to trade efficiently. And so I think that, in my view, is going to be a model to talk about the global financial architecture, a model or a prototype for how that might be deployed also in the future. One point that you mentioned about the global financial architecture and its development. One point is very important. The global financial system and its architecture has always evolved since Sumerian times and Romans. So it's never been really one thing or another. It's always evolved, and we had the gold standard not too long ago, and then the gold standard was removed. And so it keeps evolving. But until and unless a global fundamental power with a reserve convertible, fully convertible currency alters the rules of the game as they are known, it tends to evolve within the existing format. Personally, I think the greatest change that would not come from geopolitics, but would come from technology.
Okay. But the whole issue of changes within the financial system, I do want us to come back to, okay? Because there are a number of trends that we can speak about that may not have short-term implications, but certainly it's important to recognize that they are in the works. But if we could just take a look at the effect of sanctions right now on two important sectors. One, that of food and security, and another one so important around the world, that of energy. Beyond just what we already know and see, shortages and escalation in prices, inflationary trends. But let's take a look at those two. I mean, if we just think back to just a couple of weeks ago, take a look at what happened in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka, like one of many countries of what I call the global south, the developing world, was one of those countries which was trying very hard to keep afloat during COVID. And they were encouraged by the IMF and the World Bank, which was the guidance, which was unusual actually to be given to countries of the global south to borrow their way out of COVID, both to manage it and to set good foundations for healthy growth afterwards. The proviso was borrow, don't worry, we will together think of how we will pay this back. Of course, that's for a separate discussion, and maybe we don't have time for it this evening, because those systems that were supposed to be deployed to assist in paying back sovereign debt, which is well beyond that ever borne by poorer countries before, have simply failed in the breach in terms of what they were meant to do. Sri Lanka, therefore, like all other countries, had one other sector that it was quite hopeful for, and that was tourism, like Egypt. And the number 1 and 2 markets for tourism for Sri Lanka and Egypt are Russia and Ukraine. Yeah. Both visitors that from countries that have simply failed to send any tourists for very obvious reasons. And that was a death spiral for the economy of Sri Lanka. We saw, first of all, riots on the street, ordinary people, um, very upset with food shortages to begin with, escalation in the price of fuel. The riots were then met with the deployment of police. The riots escalated. Uh, the prime minister and president were forced out. There's a new prime minister who is in, but from Algeria, Tunisia, all countries in many parts of the world are now very, very concerned about not just the economic and social implications of this war, but the political dimensions of it. And so when we talk about food insecurity, when we talk about energy, all of those things are volatile. How do you view all of these things? I mean,
Well, the big framework for this conceptually is called VUCAT, VUCAT, volatile, uncertain, complex, asymmetrical, and turbulent. And that concept was developed in the US about 20 years ago, when only two of these were sort of rearing their ugly heads. Now we have all of them. So I do quite a bit in strategic foresight, in proper strategic foresight, because there are lots of predictions, gazing into crystal balls. I don't gaze into crystal balls. One of the key elements that seem to be missing, and we saw it in COVID. We are used to looking at scenarios and to say this scenario is 75% and therefore it's likely. Whereas actually we have neglected the low probability, high impact scenarios. And what we are witnessing now, globally, is a VUCAT environment that enhances low probability, high impact possibilities. I'll come back now to the financial and economic angle of this conceptual framework. For the European Union, I think to reduce low probability, high impact possibilities within the VUCAT conceptual framework in the financial services world, I think it's absolutely essential that we proceed in unusual fashion, very urgently, with completing the banking and the capital markets unions. That is absolutely critical to provide liquidity at a time when inflation is high, cash flows are suffering, and when uncertainty, complexity, and so forth are extremely high. For the rest of the world, what I mean by that, the non-Western world, I think, as I mentioned earlier, it is absolutely essential in our own interest to develop stabilization mechanisms, whether it is on food security, whether it is indeed, as in the case of Sri Lanka, for example, safety nets for sovereign debts, whether it is for inflationary pressures on the currency, because short of that, from an enlightened self-interest perspective even, let alone the human element, those turbulent situations will also affect us here or in the United States and the rest of the developed world. I think it's time to come together and devise mechanisms that are practical and deployable, not just simply political intentions.
I can't help but agree with you. But I must say that when we take a look at the multilateral framework within which we all operate in now, COVID was supposed to be a test in how we do things better. We've not done things better.
But in the
Coming out of-
financial world, it's been very successful. The
What-
system, the global financial architecture and the international monetary system survived COVID with flying colors.
But that's not what that's not the wider point that I'm getting at, in that global financial architecture was supposed to support the countries most in need. It has failed to do that. So that it has failed to do that. It's still standing, but it has failed to come to the aid and the support of countries in the world who represent more than half of the world's population. And they are bystanders in this war, and the consequences for them are huge. And the system is not adequately providing for the reality and the challenges of the developing world. That is the aspect of the architecture that I was taking a look at. And we see no end in sight. DSSI, that was supposed to be a mechanism, has completely failed. It probably provided support which was actually, at the end of the day, a drop in the bucket of what was absolutely suggested was going to have been provided. And so these countries right now are not really quite sure where to look in terms of surviving what we're seeing right now in terms of the social and political implications. So my question is, and I would like for us to get a little bit deeper into it when we come to the geopolitical aspects, because it seems that there is a paradigm shift that is required when we take a look at the world in terms of its completeness, not just the North, but the North and the South, in coming together to fix an architecture that has to be put in place and good for all of the world's people. And I know that's going to be a huge challenge.
So this is why I said we need a stabilization mechanism.
Yes.
That is political. That is not just political intentions, but deployable.
And that was my response to it. That when we take a look at COVID was supposed to be the test of goodwill, cooperation. Let's get this thing done, and it was not.
So
the
I
incentive that was actually, I thought, and many of us, looking at the situation,
I think we're talking about two different things. So the resilience of the international financial system and its architecture has been tested, and it has sort of come through with flying colors. The political will,
the purpose,
to actually to utilize parts of the architecture that was originally designed to do exactly what we mentioned. Was not used. And this is why I'm talking about a stabilization mechanism rather than a new, I'm a practical sort of, I have a practical approach to financial diplomacy. A new, entirely new institution will require a long time and a stabilization mechanism, I think, is a practical and deployable within the current institutional architecture that we have. I agree with you entirely that we need it. It doesn't exist at the moment to deal with the Sri Lankas. I think we'll have more of these Sri Lankas.
Absolutely.
I have actually, I mean, now that we're talking about this, I agree entirely for a completely different reason. Again, enlightened self-interest. Within the transition economy that we're all going through, there is a very clear shift from fossil dependency to minerals dependency. Many of these minerals are exactly in countries, in states, in economies that can do with the stabilization mechanism. And so there could be something that could work globally, in fact, in order to achieve multiple goals. Because I cannot see how we can ignore the fact that our move towards consuming more minerals can be separate from the stability and prosperity of the countries in which these minerals exist.
But you know, I'm going to nominate that you sit on one of those boards so that we get to a place where other countries can feel comfortable. Because I'll tell you, and this is just a segue into the next part of our conversation, which is going to speak to the legal ramifications of some of these issues that we're talking about tonight. One of the concerns that came out of a previous conversation that we had here, the first in the series that we had, was the fact that even whilst we are making that transition into greener technologies and greener uses or forms of energy, the EU, for example, has said that it will impose cross-border taxes on countries that it trades with that cut down trees. So Indonesia, Brazil, many of those countries are in fact Latin American, Asian, African countries are concerned because they want to trade their way out of poverty. They want to trade their way to recover out of COVID. So this idea that you have of stabilization, and the IMF has a stabilization fund, which has been there for a very, very long time and is, I think, has outlived its original purpose, and maybe it is that these are new and modern times and we need institutional policy that is fit for purpose for these times. But let's take a look.
More agile and quick.
Absolutely, absolutely. That you know, can be deployed when needed and as needed, you know. But that takes political will, and that takes political goodwill from all countries, you know. But if we take a look at the legal sanction, the legal basis of sanctions, we can say that sanctions have been weaponized as never before. Policies have been weaponized as never before. Assets of the state have been frozen. There's talk about seizing some assets so that, in fact, they could be liquidated in the rebuilding of Ukraine. And I don't want to get into the geopolitical aspects of the conversation yet, but there are two issues that stand out. One is, of course, the rattling of investor confidence. I mean, you know, investors are rightfully concerned. But what are the legal ramifications of some of the actions that we've seen taken? And how do we reconcile these with rule of law? Now, I don't yet want to talk about whether or not investors have any legal recourse, because we will come to that. But just your first take on these.
Well, I'm not a lawyer. I'm only half a lawyer. But I have long discussions about this with people who know infinitely more than I'll ever know about international public law. Because sanctions, international sanctions, are a matter of international public law. And it seems that there are effectively two types of sanctions separated or differentiated by how they are enforced. The first one is where there is a clear breach, such as in this case, in fact, where there is a party. I'll describe it in objective terms so that it's legally dry, rather than one party, one state that invades another state, and therefore there's a clear breach of international law. The international community comes together, and there is a United Nations resolution on the sanctions. That, under international public law, is enforceable as a matter of law. When there is no United Nations resolution, because of the power, the veto power of one of the member states, and there is a breach, then it's a matter of political decisions whose enforcement will depend on public-private cooperation rather than on state action per se. And we saw this in this case because companies were then requested and required or told to leave Russia, and that is what they did. So the enforcement of the sanctions is quite, it's a differentiating factor between the two. How that will play out, and I'm not a lawyer, as I said, is really probably subject for somebody who knows about international public law more than I do. The question of the rights of the private sector under these conditions, personally, I think, is going to be an interesting area of arbitration in the future, particularly where it can be proven that a departing company, for example, has been replaced by another company from another state that is non-compliant with the sanctions. I think that will be a very interesting area. I'll find it, I'm not a lawyer, I repeat that, but I find it extremely difficult to see how that is not going to be tested in the courts by by a private sector entity.
Yeah, because I mean, it's fascinating because already you hear quite a lot by way of conversation from fund managers who have stranded assets in Russia that they can't transact. They're sort of left in limbo. And the question for them is, legally, what are they to do with these stranded assets? And for the private investors, what recourse do they have?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, you take, for example, talking about funds. Let's take a very simple structure because they are infinitely more complex than this. But let's take a fund that has two investors. One is from the EU, one from entirely from India or whatever, and a country that has not signed up to the sanctions politically, because there is no United Nations resolution. And the EU investor has to leave, and the other investor continues to exist. And so is that going to be considered, and maybe they will buy their shares for €1, because it's completely, they can't hold it. In the future, is that going to be considered by the investor who had to leave as them having been replaced by another private sector entity, and therefore they might go to arbitration and see whether they can actually test a claim for damages or compensation or whatever. I think this is going to be a very interesting area in the future.
Clearly, there's an ever-growing list of things we don't know, of known unknowns.
Well, it's the sort of secondary and tertiary and consequences of.
Now let's shift gears a little bit, and we're going to go into the final aspect of our conversation this afternoon on the geopolitical ramifications of all of this, which in a sense is the most tricky part for us to have a conversation on. But let's face it, there are a number of countries in the world, many of them from the global south, but not all of them, who are taking a look at the Western international global financial system and the way it can be and has been weaponized against one state. And their worry, and I think understandably so, is a question to themselves: how can they prepare themselves for a situation which might not be an invasion of any third-party country, in which they might have crossed a red line for, let's say, the United States? And how do they prepare themselves? And I want to specifically get into a couple of scenarios. One is the issue of SWIFT. That is crippling. We know that countries like China, for some time now, have been building their own equivalent. Is the cross-border interbank payment system known as SIPS, which right now represents less than 1% of all financial transactions when compared to SWIFT. Small. But several things have been happening. One is that China slowly, but quietly, has been encouraging some countries with whom it does trade as a result of the One Belt, One Road project, which is international in scope, to undertake trade in the, and I never pronounce the Chinese currency very well, renminbi?
Yes.
Yeah, is that
Perfect.
correct?
That's
Oh,
very
good.
nice. Very nice.
Oof.
Very nice.
Wow, thank you. I give myself a little brownie point here. All right. They have been very quietly trying to replace, to a certain extent, the US dollar as the tradable currency, as the balance of payment, as the payment of goods and services around the world. There's a long way to go because we know that the US, the greenback, in 2000 was as much as 70% of all goods and services transacted around the world were paid for in US dollars. Today it is just under 60%. It's about 59.2%. Okay? So any other system is going to have a long way to go, and any other currency faces a lot of obstacles that we can talk about. But the question I have, and I don't want to, so there are two questions in one. One is the replaceability of the US dollar as the reserve currency of the world. That's one. And two is the bypassing of SWIFT as an alternate system for financial transactions of the world. So the question that I have, and countries might also have, is that by weaponizing sanctions in such an absolute way, does that not incentivize countries like China and others to work on means of protecting themselves and their own legitimate interest? After all, a country's sovereign wealth that might be domiciled in Ecuador, let's say, that country still wants to know that it can tap into its wealth and its assets overseas when it needs to. Are we talking about rule and law and all of these things? So, to my mind, these are legitimate concerns for countries that are right now taking a look at what's going on with immeasurable concern for their own future in terms of how they operate within the international system. So two questions for you.
I will take various things
Okay.
apart because there are lots of
There
things.
are lots of things in there, but
Talking about
can I just say that I just want to make sure that we deal with alternatives
sure.
and the currency reserve, right?
So, but first you mentioned the assets. There is a big difference between freezing assets and seizing assets. We have not seized assets yet. Assets are frozen.
What about the yachts?
They are frozen. To move towards seizing assets, you get into rule of law issues, because then it's private property and how to what are the legal grounds acceptable in court to seize somebody's private property, somebody's assets. There are precedents. In Italy, there is a particular system there, but people are looking at various alternatives, whether that can be done or not, because if it is tested in court and the court overturns a government's decision to seize assets, then that will, of course, undermine the entire program of asset seizures. So they have to get it right, and the reasons have to be right. My understanding is that there is a great reluctance to move towards seizure, because once you allow the state to seize private assets, regardless of Russia, you are moving into a very tricky area across the board. So it is very important in terms of the rule of law to look at this very key difference. And I think the press has not really made that distinction very clear. So that's number one. To have, dealing with the currency question, to have a global reserve currency, it needs to be fully convertible. China, for example, will have a decision to make on balance. Do they allow them to will they be willing to loosen their control over the currency in order to have full convertibility? Or will they continue to control the currency and accept a small share of the global of a global role in terms of dominance of the yuan? Okay, so this is a key element. To have full convertibility is what enables a currency to become a dominant, a global reserve currency. So that, I think, is a political decision as much as it is an economic decision. And apart from China, I don't see any other power globally that will be, maybe if Europe at some point starts to make certain political decisions, that may well become a possibility, but I also see that sort of into the distant future. So for the time being, the global reserve currency for the foreseeable future, in my view, is going to be the US greenback. Equally importantly, is that the strength of the US dollar as a global reserve currency also rests on the geopolitical dominance and military power of the US. So as long as the US maintains its geopolitical dominance and military superiority, that is a key support mechanism, in principle, for any currency, a key support mechanism for the US dollar. So that's on the currency. The second question was on the SIPs and the SWIFT. There are really thinking conceptually about it. There are three legs, a tripod, if you like, for the global financial architecture. One is regulatory, the other is trade, and the other is currency. And countries try to avoid balance of payment crises because that could lead to confrontation and enhance their opportunities of being supported by the global financial system when they have a crisis by signing up voluntarily to become members of the international financial monetary system and financial architecture. In other words, there is no one meeting that happened one day for 142 countries or whatever it is, 160 countries, and they all signed the same agreements on regulations, on banking, on securities, on insurance, on SWIFT, and so forth. It is a very gradual, incremental process in which countries decide it is in their interest to join the international monetary system and its architecture because it enhances their ability to trade with their neighbors and main trading partners and enables them to avoid balance of payment crises. SWIFT is the, if you like, the cooling oil that goes around. I mean, it's the enabler of the global trading system. And trade and exchange rates, of course, are two sides of the same coin in many ways. But this is the SWIFT is the system that enables the international monetary system to discharge its obligations. In order to replace that, any other system, SIPs or any other system, will have to reach a degree of maturity that will, in effect, it cannot just create the cooling system. It has to build the engine around it as well. I think it is not impossible because of the advent of digital currencies. I think whoever dominates the digital currencies market in the future will dominate global trade. And that will lead, this is why I said trade, technology, and finance are merging. And that will lead effectively to a new, de facto, monetary system and a new emerging architecture, because that is a disruptive technology.
So I need to come in here and ask you, because it dovetails entirely with what you're saying, but it might be disruptive as well. When we take a look at the big economies right now, I mean, we know Switzerland is ahead of the game in many ways with respect of approach to digital.
Sorry, can I clarify? Digital currencies are not cryptocurrencies.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about Bitcoin. Digital currencies are central bank issued currencies.
And that's what I'm speaking about.
Sorry.
Okay. So that when we take a look at the big countries, China is way ahead of the game in terms of the development of the digital renminbi, right? So where does that take us? And can I just say something else? We need to wrap up in 5 minutes, and I still have a couple of questions to go. So a very short response to this one. Where does that take us?
It's not just China. In the Strategic Foresight report of the European Commission of August last year, the development of a digital euro was a priority. And it mentions trade, and it mentions energy, and it mentions geopolitics. The Bank of England is trying also. I think it's a race. I think it's an exciting and interesting race. There is no answer as to who is going to be successful in deploying it first. There are all sorts of barriers, including in democratic societies, privacy, because you will have a wallet at the central bank with your digital currency. So somebody will see what are you paying, what are you buying, except, of course, if there is a system in place that will separate. So there are things to be overcome. It's not impossible. It's perfectly doable. But whoever is going to deploy, I say deploy, not develop, actually deploy a currency, a digital currency, that is convenient, probably is the wrong word, but I think you get what I mean, convenient for global trade, I think we'll have a very good shot at reshaping the SWIFTs of the system, the global financial architecture. Because our regulatory system, if you like, is analog. I'm using this crudely, but it's trying to catch up with digitalization and the digital world. And if there is something that will make it completely susceptible to fundamental change, i.e. something new, then I think we will have something new. Yes.
Okay. We're coming down to our final reflections.
Can I add one thing very quickly?
Only if it's short.
Yeah, because change, I think change will take place through technology. And therefore, whoever will command innovation will also lead that change, and therefore will be first in designing the basic blocks of the new system, whatever it may be.
And you think if that's China, and this wasn't a question that I was going to ask, but you think if that is China, that the rest of the world will follow those rules of the game?
No, we may have to. I mean,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, down to our final thoughts here. You know, as we've been engaged in the conversation, I've been busy thinking that we've learnt new words. You know, anti-vaxxers, vaxxers, de-swifting. was not a word that I'd ever heard of until recently. But it's also occurred to me that, this war coming in the most untimely of ways for the world. I'm not talking about whether it's right or wrong. I'm just saying we needed a break from COVID, and the break we expected was not a war. But this is what we have. But it causes pause to reflect in a number of areas, and closer to home in the Caribbean and Latin America, and I'm seeing a colleague and friend from the Embassy of Ecuador here. We are busy preparing for a summit of the Americas, which will take place in June. And summits of Americas for the Western Hemisphere, as opposed to the Western world, are very important affairs for Canada, for Latin America, the Caribbean, the United States, equivalent of the OAS. In the past, Cuba had always been excluded. But when we met, and I was party to the conversation with President Obama years ago in his first term, as a group, Latin America and the Caribbean, in meeting with the President Obama for the very first time, April 2008, I think it was, we said to him that the one thing we wanted him to take care of was to restore a historical wrong, and that was on the matter of Cuba. That Cuba was part of our space, our geography, but part of who we were, and Cuba could not be excluded from the Organization of American States and from various summits. The last two summits of the Americas, Cuba has been present. I'm not quite sure yet what's going on with the OAS, which is a different kettle of fish, but Cuba has been present at the last two summits. And this we might ask, well, what's the relationship to issues of war? But I'm just thinking the spillover effects are pretty wide, and I'll tell you why I'm thinking so. The White House has declared, announced just a few days ago, or last week, that they would not be inviting Cuba, and not be inviting Venezuela, and not be inviting, I think it's Guatemala, or is it Nicaragua? Nicaragua? Nicaragua would not be inviting those three countries to Summit of the Americas. And the leaders of Latin America and the Caribbean have taken exception to this. Brazil has said if those leaders are not invited, then Brazil's leadership will not be there. Mexico has said the same thing, and a number of Caribbean leaders have said we're not coming. And it is the first time we've seen this concentrated action with respect of a very, very powerful neighbor. And these are also among some of the countries that have not taken sides, and I'm not going to say neutrality in this particular case is an exercise of sovereignty, right? They're not making pronouncements at the UN or anything like that. But this is the very first time this has happened, and it speaks to a number of issues, to my mind, about the sensibility for a large part of the world that their interests are very much bound in the idea of multipolarity in the world, which gives them the benefit of a menu of greater choices in terms of partnerships. When we think of China, when we think of Russia, we know that countries and many others have spoken about wanting to work with a multipolar world rather than a unipolar world. This action on the part of small actors from the Caribbean and Latin America speaks to a wider and deeper trend that we're seeing geopolitically in terms of interest, accommodations, multipolarity, unipolarity, the idea of a hegemon, and all of these sort of things. I think it's a fascinating period of time geopolitically for those of us who are not political per se, but in a sense taking a look at all of these trends and trying to have conversations about where is all of this leading. And I'm not asking you that question, but that was just my own kind of reflection. And if I were to say in 2 minutes, your final reflection on some of the conversations we've had before we invite our colleagues and friends who've been
I
listening
will
patiently.
comment on what you just said because
Okay.
I think it's a good also
Okay.
inroads, a good lead into the Q&A. I think, first of all, I think there is a fundamental difference with any other situation in the past that we'd seen because we are facing the prospects of losing the rules-based order that is the source of prosperity for a large part of the world. And so I think the choice, the delicate choice, the very difficult choice that we are facing, particularly in Europe, is that we can either, let's not forget, peace, prosperity, and sorry,
The third one.
yeah, peace, prosperity, progress are and security. Sorry, peace, prosperity, and security, and they are all three are being very seriously undermined. And I think we have, unfortunately, potentially, putting it crudely, but the choice between spending money or treasure or blood to restore the rules-based order. And that is a very difficult and complex choice, as we're seeing, because we've decided to supply the Ukraine with arms and impose sanctions that will also have economic impact on us. So we're trying to come to some sort of medium that is politically sustainable to try to deal with this threat to our vital interest in the rules-based system. States have vital interests and they have other interests. And this is a vital interest, number one. Number two, I think we're also facing the challenge of dealing with regimes and states now moving forward that we have an interest in dealing with them, but we do not share their values. And we cannot impose our values on them any longer. And I think that is going to pose another political and diplomatic dilemma that will test our domestic political cohesion and resilience, and frankly, the skill of our diplomacy.
Okay, all right. So there we have it. Thank you so very much, all of you. And please, for a few minutes, we'd be delighted to hear from you rather than one of us. Please. Anyone? Christina, then, might I invite you? My colleague, Christina, is a very senior member of the Embassy of Ecuador. And I know speaking to issues pertaining to the Summit of the Americas is very close to home for us. But not on this particularly, but on anything that comes to mind based on the conversation we've been having.
Thank you, Lan, for the invitation. Interesting to share this conversation with you, Ambassador. It's interesting that you were speaking about the spillover effects of this because obviously our countries in Latin America have been seeing it and not at all prepared to what was coming. And it has been a strong hit in the economies which were not yet recovered from the COVID crisis. So I was thinking about, for instance, what you were mentioning about the SWIFT. There are many Ecuadorian companies that are selling to Russia. They're selling bananas or shrimp or even roses and flowers that have been dealing with this problem of not knowing exactly what to expect regarding their sales. These are crops that are not they're not going to wait in the fields to be cultivated. So that imposes also a challenge for the foreign policy, because to the extent that we share values with Europe or the US regarding the respect for human rights and for freedom, there's also an inherent sovereignty in the interests of a country that are intimately related to the economic survival of the people that are back there producing. So that's something that it's in the debate. It's a political debate, but what my feeling is that it's a political challenge, but actually it's an economic debate as well, because there is the need to look for this kind of alternatives, because business must go on, especially when you don't have the markets in Europe to absorb this kind of production, or maybe because they don't want it, or because they just don't consume the same. So it was just interesting to discuss about
Thank
it.
you. Can I just ask, because we have gone on for a bit, and we should be already having a little bit of a something at the back there. Can we hear from a couple of you, and then we can then just wrap up, please. And then this gentleman.
Maybe you could elaborate about what should be or could be the next steps to track China, Russia.
You mean from a financial perspective or
Yes.
generally?
First financial,
Yeah.
and then
Okay.
what else?
Thank you, madam. This gentleman.
Okay, I speak on.
Oh,
I have a specific question about the payment in rubles. The Russian decree end of March imposes European banks to pass to open two accounts and to transit through Gazprom Bank, which has not been sanctioned, still operating through SWIFT. There is no idea for Europe to sanction this bank. Why? I don't know. Question for you. And so now there is this obligation to pay in ruble, to have these two accounts and to pay in ruble. In April, Europe has received oil and gas from Russia. In May, now, yesterday, today, tomorrow, European banks have to pay in these double accounts. The ruble account has been considered illegal by the European Commission guidelines and by the US. So this is a kind of circumvention of the subsidy, of the sanctions. How this gas we received in April is going to be paid by European banks, including Belgian banks, to Russia. According to the press, four European banks have opened a ruble-denominated account in Gazprom Bank. This is illegal.
That's not my understanding, but we can.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
can answer
Yeah.
the question.
How to sort out the matter?
Okay.
Yeah, and then this gentleman, please, and then.
Yeah, just a very quick question, if I may. I might just try and tempt you to a bit of crystal ball gazing. My question is very much around the nexus you've described brilliantly about digital currencies, I should say, the US dollar being weaponized. We've talked about it. I would be very curious to hear your, and it's wholly speculative, granted, but your take on short-term, say, next year or two, impact on world currency exchanges. How likely is a euro crisis because of the Ukraine crisis, and are we looking, for instance, at a next edition of a peso crisis? So I'd love to hear your insights on pressures on exchange rates triggered by everything that's going on. So that's my question for you.
So Bashir, you've got
So I'll
three
start
different.
from. I completely agree with you. This is why I said geoeconomics will drive geopolitics. And this is why I also said there will be an inherent conflict between values and interests in many cases. So you brilliantly gave a if you like, a case study very vividly of how interest and value are going to collide, continue to collide, and how geoeconomics is going to drive geopolitics. How are we in Europe going to deal now with the Central African countries? Question mark. When we need, because China is a big player for minerals there, for example. What are we going to do? How are we going to deal with that interest versus value and geoeconomics? Because the question of the transition economy has enormous impact on geoeconomics, which have now, it's, in my view, is going to be a key driver of geopolitics. So I'm afraid that's why I talked about VUCAT. I really think, and that links, maybe I take your point together, because that links to VUCAT. We are going to have an environment of very high volatility, uncertainty, complexity, turbulence, and asymmetry. How countries, individual countries, are going, or supranational bodies like the EU, are going to deal with VUCAT is going to be, in my view, perhaps I'm slightly more optimistic about the ability to manage this, is to deal with it tactically, but with a strategic view on stabilizing strategic sectors of the economy and the key elements of the democratic system. So the cost of living crisis is a key element in a democratic system. Cost of living crisis is driven by inflation, among other things. We need to stabilize that, but at the same time, tactically, that's strategic goal, but tactically we also need to manage how we pay for the gas and get the gas until we find diversification. How do you sell the flowers, how to pay for until you find other markets or not, as the case may be. That period, I think, is going to be extremely risky, dangerous for the world. Sorry? Yes, because we simply don't know whether a particular, like Sri Lanka, who would have thought? But suddenly you have a failure in a key strategic spot. And then we all have to, I think, collaboratively, in solidarity, try to stabilize these situations very quickly. That's why I talked about agility and speed. I think agility and speed are going to be extremely important in order to be able to manage this period until we reduce the VUCAT globally. Will Ecuador or other similar states be able to utilize alternative payment systems? I fear not. But how will the international financial architecture start to cater for a new situation? That is, for me, the key point. And I think this is where countries like Ecuador can exercise enormous pressure collectively on the key institutions in the international financial system to demand that there is a way of sorting out their payment problems, their balance of their payment problems to start off with, their currency issues, and to argue for the stabilization mechanism. I think we will need the Ecuadors to come together and to demand that stabilization mechanism, because me talking about it alone isn't going to do it. And at the same time, to talk through the institutions of the financial architecture to find out a way of making the payment system work. So in the next year or two, I used to have many friends who dealt in currencies. I'm afraid it's being awake all hours and not being swayed by news. I think that's going to be key, but rather by momentum and the dynamics of the market. I think that's going to be really key, because in an environment of disinformation, and I go here to hybrid threats, an environment of disinformation, you can't really, in the next, as a trader, for example, in currencies, you can't just simply react. I think you need to, if you like, play the market and see where momentum is going without having huge positions on your book, if I'm to put it sort of bluntly. For the payment of Gazprom, my understanding is that the German position is that they pay euro into Gazprom Bank, and then Gazprom Bank has a facility to convert it to ruble. Yes. But the payment mechanically and literally is in euro. Yes. So technically, it's not a violation. This is the position. I don't know about President Draghi. I'm talking about Germany. How much Germany exercises political. I'm sure it's not. But this is my understanding of what the German position is, which I assume is the European position.
Our last minute.
What is next? I fear that for Russia, there is no good news. The Ministry of Economy is the Russian Ministry of Economy is forecasting contraction of the Russian economy by 8%, the Ministry of Finance by 12%. The Russian Central Bank report, and I urge you, if you have difficulty sleeping and if you have nothing better to do, read parts of the report, because it is surprising how candid and pessimistic it is. I don't know who wrote it, but it is clearly talking about the future of technology in Russia being in reverse. I refer her specifically, by the way, to the software sanctions on semiconductor software by the US, or the US sanctions semiconductor software, because then even China is reluctant to help the Russians in case there are sanctions on the software end. And so, very directly, that is from the horse's mouth. Internationally, I refer you to my earlier, I think the next year is going to be extremely volatile, and we will need to tactically manage, but within a strategic framework aiming at various things. For example, in Europe, each region will be very different, of course, but in Europe we'll be diversifying away from energy and stabilizing, and I repeat, we have elections coming up across Europe, stabilizing the cost of living crisis, and therefore eliminating the possibility of inflation turning from an economic risk into a socio-political element.
On that note, thank you so very much, Bashir. I think that the one other ingredient we need going forward is the rebuilding of trust. Because in large measure, among the countries of the world, a lot has been lost. But I want to thank you so very, very much for being here, for your attentive participation. Bashir, my friend, thank you so very much. To the Press Club, thank you as always for your support. And we are supposed to partake of some little things at the back, but we have overextended our time because normally they will be closing up now, but we have a few minutes to meet at the back and continue very brief conversation. So thank you, my friend.
Thank you.